There's a photograph you cannot throw away. In it, faces frozen in time, people you once knew with the intimacy of your own breath. Their laughter echoes in the margins of the image, their arms around your shoulders, their eyes reflecting a version of you that no longer exists. You look at this photograph sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and your defenses are down, and you feel something ancient and terrible stir in your chest. Not nostalgia, not quite grief. Something else. The pain of outgrowing people you love is a wound that bleeds inward. It leaves no scar you can point to, no broken bone that shows up on an X-ray. Yet it is perhaps the most profound agony consciousness can experience, because it asks you to betray the very thing that makes you human, your capacity for loyalty, for constancy, for love that transcends change. Tonight, we descend into this pain. We explore the architecture of a peculiar human tragedy, the moment when your evolution demands that you leave behind the very people who helped you become who you are. This is not a story about abandonment, though it will feel like it. This is not about betrayal, though your nervous system will scream that accusation into the void of your sleepless nights. This is a story about the terrible mathematics of growth, about the price consciousness charges for its expansion, about the silent war between the person you were becoming and the person they needed you to remain. We call this season the sleep of the mind, that twilight realm where ego constructs prisons disguised as sanctuaries, where denial becomes a language we speak fluently, where we clutch false identities like drowning swimmers clinging to driftwood, and nowhere is this sleep deeper than in the relationships we refuse to outgrow, even as they suffocate the very life from our becoming. The ancient Greeks had a word, metanoia, a transformation of mind so complete that the person who emerges from it is fundamentally, irreversibly altered. The Christians later translated it as repentance, but this domestication misses the original terror, the annihilation implicit in genuine metamorphosis. When a caterpillar becomes a butterfly, the transformation is not gentle. Inside the chrysalis, the caterpillar does not simply grow wings. It liquefies. It dissolves into a protein soup before reconstructing itself into something unrecognizable. Now imagine, what if that caterpillar had friends? Other caterpillars who said, "We love you exactly as you are. Don't change. Stay here with us, crawling on leaves, eating what we've always eaten, seeing what we've always seen." What would it feel like to leave them behind, to know that your transformation would render you incomprehensible to them? To understand that love, as they defined it, required your stagnation? This is where we begin our journey, at the crossroads where growth meets loyalty, where self-actualization collides with attachment, where the future version of you murders, slowly and agonizingly, the relationships that defined your past. By the time we emerge from this exploration, you will understand why this pain is not a flaw in your character, but a feature of consciousness itself. You will see how the ego constructs elaborate stories to avoid this suffering, stories that keep you small, safe, and surrounded by familiar voices, even as your soul screams for wider horizons. You will learn that the pain of outgrowing people you love is actually 3 pains braided together. The pain of your own transformation, the pain of their inability to witness it, and the pain of a world that tells you that real love should transcend all change, a beautiful lie that keeps millions trapped in identities they've long since outgrown. But more than understanding, you will feel something shift. Because this is not merely an intellectual exercise. This is an excavation of the deepest chambers of human attachment, where neurology meets mythology, where psychology embraces philosophy, where the story of every individual who ever dared to grow mirrors the epic of consciousness itself, slowly awakening from its ancient sleep. So settle in, breathe. What we're about to explore will hurt, not because it's wrong, but because it's true. And truth, when it involves the death of old versions of ourselves and the relationships that sustained them, always hurts before it liberates. We begin not with answers, but with a question that has haunted human consciousness since the first person dared to look beyond the cave. What does it mean to love someone when the person they love no longer exists? The architecture of attachment. The first separation. In the beginning, there was no separation. You floated in warm darkness, your heartbeat synchronized with another's, nourished by blood that was not your own, breathing oxygen you did not gather, existing in the only true paradise consciousness will ever know, complete, perfect fusion with another being. Then came the violence of birth. The first breath is the first betrayal. Your lungs inflate, and in that moment you become separate, individual, alone. The umbilical cord, that last tether to oceanic unity, is severed, and you scream, not because of pain, though there is pain, but because consciousness has just tasted the first bitter drop of existential isolation. Psychologists call this the primary separation. But it is more than developmental milestone. It is the original wound, the founding trauma of selfhood. From this moment forward, every human being spends their life navigating a paradox. We are separate, yet we cannot survive without connection. We are individuals, yet our individuality only makes sense in relation to others. The infant brain, in those first months, does not yet understand where mother ends and self begins. This is not ignorance. It is the last echo of primordial unity. The mother's face becomes the infant's first mirror, the first surface upon which the nascent self can see its own reflection. British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott called this mirroring, the way a mother's responsive gaze literally constructs the child's sense of existing. When the mother smiles at the infant's babbling, she is not merely being affectionate, she is confirming, "You exist. I see you. You matter." And the infant's brain, still plastic and hungry for pattern, begins to form its first and most fundamental belief about reality. I am because I am seen. This is where attachment theory begins, in the crucible of that first relationship, where survival and love are indistinguishable, where the quality of connection literally shapes the architecture of the developing brain. John Bowlby, the father of attachment theory, studied children separated from their parents during World War II. What he discovered fundamentally altered our understanding of human development. These children didn't just miss their parents, they showed physiological changes. Their stress hormones remained elevated, their immune systems weakened. Some simply stopped growing, a condition called failure to thrive. The message was clear. For human children, isolation is not merely unpleasant, it is lethal. We are, at our biological core, relational creatures. Our brains literally require connection to develop properly. The patterns of attachment we form in those early years, secure, anxious, avoidant, disorganized, become the templates through which we will understand every subsequent relationship for the rest of our lives. But here is what the attachment researchers only whispered, what the developmental psychologists approached with caution. The same mechanism that allows us to bond, that capacity for deep, regulatory, identity-forming connection, is the same mechanism that will one day torture us when we outgrow those bonds. The neurology of recognition. Imagine the human brain as a prediction machine. This is not metaphor, this is neuroscience. Your brain does not passively receive reality. It actively constructs reality, moment by moment, based on patterns learned from past experience. Every face you see, your brain compares against templates of faces stored in memory. Every voice, every touch, every emotional tone, all filtered through what neuroscientist Carl Friston calls predictive processing. And the most important patterns your brain learns? The patterns of significant others. In the temporal lobe, there are neurons, literal cells, that respond specifically to familiar faces. Your mother's face, your best friend's smile, your partner's frown. Each has a dedicated neural signature, a constellation of firing patterns that light up at recognition. These are not mere memories. They are structural features of your brain's architecture. When you see someone you love, something extraordinary happens. The brain releases oxytocin, the bonding hormone. Heart rate synchronizes. If you've been close long enough, even your breathing patterns may align. Mirror neurons fire, creating a literal neural echo of the other person's emotional state inside your own nervous system. This is why empathy feels like feeling, because neurologically you are feeling a simulation of their experience. But here's the evolutionary trick, the cosmic joke embedded in our neurology. Your brain doesn't just recognize people, it recognizes patterns of being with people. Over time, your sense of self becomes interwoven with their presence. The way they laugh at your jokes reinforces certain aspects of your personality. The way they lean in when you speak about your dreams validates certain aspirations. The way they change the subject when you mention certain topics teaches you which parts of yourself are acceptable and which must remain hidden. Slowly, imperceptibly, you begin to perform a version of yourself that fits the shape of the relationship. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself based on experience, means that repeated interactions literally carve grooves in your neural pathways. You become the person they know you to be, not through conscious choice, but through the million micro-adjustments your nervous system makes to maintain connection. And this is beautiful. This is how deep friendship works, how families form identities, how communities create cultures. We sculpt each other through attention and recognition until we change. The philosophical problem, identity through time. In ancient Greece, there was a thought experiment called the ship of Theseus. Imagine a ship, the great vessel that carried the hero Theseus home from his adventures. Over the years, as planks rot and sails tear, each piece is gradually replaced. First the mast, then the hull, then the rigging, piece by piece, until eventually not a single original component remains. The question, is it still the same ship? Philosophers have argued about this for 2 millennia. Some say yes, the ship's identity persists through change. Others say no, it's merely a replica, a copy masquerading as the original. Some try to split the difference. It's the same ship functionally, but not materially. But what they all miss is the emotional weight of the question. Because you are the ship of Theseus. Every cell in your body has been replaced multiple times since childhood. The atoms that compose you now are not the atoms that composed you 7 years ago. The thoughts that fill your mind today bear little resemblance to the thoughts of your teenage self. The values you hold, the dreams you chase, the very way you perceive reality, all of it has been quietly, relentlessly replaced. And yet something persists, some thread of continuity that allows you to say I and mean the same person across decades of transformation. Derek Parfit, the Oxford philosopher, pushed this question to its breaking point. He asked, what if your transformation is so complete that your values, memories, and personality bear no resemblance to your former self? Are you still the same person? And if not, do you have moral obligations to maintain relationships formed by a person who no longer exists? Most people don't think about this philosophically. They live it emotionally. You sit across from your childhood best friend, and the conversation feels hollow. Not because anyone did anything wrong, but because the person they're talking to, the version of you they know, the stories they reference, the shared memories they find comforting, that person is gone, replaced. The ship of Theseus came back to port, and everyone expects it to be the same vessel. But you know different. You feel different. Every plank has been replaced, and the pain begins, not with a bang, but with a whisper. I don't belong here anymore. The mythology of constancy. Every culture has myths about transformation, and every transformation myth contains a warning about the cost. In Ovid's Metamorphoses, transformation is often punishment. Daphne becomes a laurel tree to escape Apollo's pursuit. Arachne becomes a spider for her hubris. Actaeon becomes a stag and is torn apart by his own hunting dogs. The message embedded in these myths: change is dangerous. It separates you from community. It renders you unrecognizable. It can destroy you. But there are other myths, darker and more relevant. The Greek hero Odysseus spends 20 years away from home, fighting wars, sailing strange seas, encountering gods and monsters. When he finally returns to Ithaca, his wife Penelope doesn't recognize him. He's aged, scarred, transformed by experience. Even his son Telemachus, now a man himself, struggles to accept that this stranger is his father. The myth tells us Odysseus proves his identity by revealing a secret about their marriage bed. But read deeper, what really happens is that Odysseus has to perform his old identity to be recognized. He has to become, for a moment, the man he was 20 years ago. And perhaps this is why so many heroes in mythology refuse the call to adventure. They know, at some primal level, that if they leave, they cannot truly return, because the journey will change them in ways that make them incompatible with the life they left behind. Joseph Campbell called this the hero's journey, but he was less honest about the loneliness of return. Frodo carrying the burden of the ring back to the Shire, only to discover he no longer fits there. Jesus returning to Nazareth and being rejected by his childhood community. The Buddha leaving behind his wife and child to pursue enlightenment, then returning as someone fundamentally other. These myths persist because they describe something true about consciousness. Growth is inherently lonely. Transformation isolates. Every expansion of awareness creates distance between you and those still operating from the level of consciousness you've transcended. This is not spiritual superiority. This is not intellectual arrogance. This is simple, brutal geometry. When you evolve into new dimensions of understanding, those who remain in the old dimensions cannot follow. Not because they lack capacity, but because they haven't made the journey. They haven't paid the price. And here's the cruelest part. They don't understand why you've changed. From their perspective, you haven't expanded. You've betrayed. You haven't grown. You've abandoned. You haven't evolved. You've become a stranger. They remember you as you were, and they want that person back. They need that person back, because their sense of self, their own ship of Theseus, includes you as you were. Your change threatens their stability. So they resist, not consciously, not maliciously, but inevitably. And you find yourself at the crossroads where love meets evolution, where loyalty confronts truth, where the person you were and the person you're becoming engage in a silent war over the territory of your soul. The prison of familiar love. The first fracture. It begins with small moments. You're at dinner with friends you've known since college. They're telling the same stories, laughing at the same jokes, mining the same vein of shared history that once felt like pure gold, but now feels like obligation. Someone mentions a person you all used to know, and everyone performs their assigned role in the collective memory. The funny one, the serious one, the wild one, the responsible one. You play your part. You smile at the right moment. Contribute your designated line. Let the familiar script unfold. But somewhere inside, a small voice whispers, "This isn't me anymore." You ignore it. Push it down. Tell yourself you're being ungrateful. That these people love you. That friendship means showing up even when it feels stale. But the voice persists. A few weeks later, you're on the phone with your mother. She's giving advice on your career, your relationships, your life choices. The advice is well-meaning, delivered with love, wrapped in concern for your well-being. But it's advice for a person you used to be, someone with different fears, different dreams, different ways of understanding the world. You try to explain your new perspective. She doesn't hear it. Not really. She hears rebellion, influence from the wrong people, a phase you're going through. She says, "You're just overthinking things," or "You've always been so sensitive," or "I liked you better when you were more light-hearted." And you realize, she doesn't want you to change. She wants you to remain the child she knew how to love. This is how the fracture begins, not with dramatic confrontation, but with accumulating moments of misrecognition. Each interaction where you have to edit yourself, Each conversation where you bite your tongue, each gathering where you perform an outdated version of yourself for an audience that cannot conceive of your evolution. The psychologist Carl Rogers called this conditions of worth, the ways significant others make their love conditional on you being who they need you to be, not consciously, not cruelly, but simply because human beings have limits to their capacity for accommodating change in people they've already categorized. Your friend needs you to be the funny one because that role balances their seriousness. Your parent needs you to be the responsible one because that role confirms their success as a caregiver. Your partner needs you to be the passionate one because that role validates their own emotional intensity. These aren't malicious manipulations. They're the natural result of human relationality. We form bonds based on mutual recognition, and mutual recognition requires some degree of stability. If everyone in a relationship changed constantly and unpredictably, there would be no basis for trust, no ground for intimacy. The problem is, you are changing, and the relationship infrastructure, the habits of interaction, the patterns of recognition, the emotional contracts written in the early days of connection, that infrastructure was built for a different person. The ego's defense. The ego has a vested interest in stability. This needs to be understood clearly. The ego is not your enemy. The ego is a necessary function of consciousness, the part that maintains continuity of identity across time, that allows you to say I and mean something consistent, that protects the organism from the chaos of perpetual flux. But the ego is also conservative. It resists change because change threatens its primary function, survival through predictability. In the work of Carl Jung, the ego is the center of conscious awareness, the I that thinks it's running the show. But beneath the ego lies the shadow, all the rejected, repressed, denied aspects of self that don't fit the ego's self-image. And beneath that lies the self, the deeper organizing principle that drives individuation, the process of becoming fully who you actually are, rather than who you think you should be. Individuation, Jung warned, is painful. It requires confronting the shadow. It demands integration of aspects of yourself that contradict your self-concept. And it inevitably brings you into conflict with the collective, with family, community, culture, because the collective has an investment in you remaining a predictable, manageable member. When you begin to outgrow relationships, your ego panics. It tells you stories. You're being selfish. You're betraying people who love you. You're not really changing. You're just confused. If you were truly evolved, you could maintain these relationships without difficulty. These are defense mechanisms, psychological immune responses designed to prevent the dissolution of identity that genuine transformation requires. Sigmund Freud catalogued these defenses: denial, repression, rationalization, projection. But he missed the most insidious defense of all, the one most relevant to our exploration: regression in service of attachment. You make yourself smaller. You return to old patterns, old ways of being, old versions of yourself, not because you want to, but because your nervous system has learned that this is how you maintain connection. Your brain, wired for survival, prioritizes attachment over authenticity, because historically, for humans, isolation was death. So you regress. You laugh at jokes you don't find funny. You pretend interest in topics that bore you. You resurrect old personality traits like costumes stored in the back of a closet. You perform the person they remember, all while feeling yourself fragmenting, splitting, becoming stranger to yourself with each performance. And here's the terrible mathematics. The more you regress, the more resentment builds. And the more resentment builds, the more guilt you feel for that resentment. And the more guilt you feel, the harder you try to prove your love by regressing further. It's a spiral, a slow-motion psychological catastrophe dressed up as loyalty, the neuroscience of cognitive dissonance. Inside your brain, a war is being fought. Two neural networks competing for dominance. One represents the pattern of self with others that's been carved deep by years of repetition. The other represents the emerging pattern of new self, the version of you trying to be born. Neuroscientist Michael Gazzaniga calls this the interpreter, the left hemisphere's compulsive need to create coherent narratives from conflicting data. When your brain receives contradictory information, I love these people, and being with these people makes me feel false, the interpreter scrambles to create a story that resolves the contradiction. Usually the story blames you. I'm ungrateful. I'm selfish. There's something wrong with me that I can't just be happy with people who love me. This is cognitive dissonance, the psychological stress of holding contradictory beliefs simultaneously. And your brain, desperate to resolve this stress, will often sacrifice truth for coherence. It's easier to believe you're broken than to accept that the relationship has run its natural course. It's less painful to pathologize your own growth than to acknowledge that love, as currently configured, requires your diminishment. The research on cognitive dissonance shows something fascinating. The more we invest in a relationship, the harder it becomes to acknowledge when that relationship no longer serves us. Psychologists call this sunk cost fallacy in decision-making, but in relationships it's more profound. You've poured years of your life into these bonds. You've shared secrets, survived crises, built traditions. Walking away feels like declaring that all of it was meaningless, that the investment was wasted. But this is false logic, another trick of the ego. The fact that something was valuable in the past doesn't obligate it to be valuable forever. The fact that someone helped you become who you are doesn't mean they're equipped to witness who you're becoming. The fact that love once flowed easily doesn't mean maintaining it should require your self-betrayal. Yet we cling, we rationalize, we contort ourselves into familiar shapes, all while feeling the slow death of authenticity that comes from living in expired relationships. The social contract. We never signed. There's an unspoken agreement embedded in most human relationships, a contract written in invisible ink, enforced not by law but by guilt. You will not change in ways that inconvenience me. No one says this out loud. It would sound absurd, even monstrous. We celebrate growth in the abstract. We post inspirational quotes about transformation. We praise people for evolving, as long as their evolution doesn't disrupt our comfort. But the moment your growth requires others to adjust their perception of you, to revise their narratives, to update their understanding, you encounter resistance. The French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre wrote about bad faith, the way people lie to themselves to avoid the anxiety of freedom. But he also wrote about how we use each other to stabilize our own identities. We need others to see us in specific ways because their gaze confirms our sense of self. When you change, you violate this implicit contract. You pull the foundation out from under their self-understanding. Because if you can change this much, if you can become someone they don't recognize, what does that say about their own fixity? What does your transformation imply about their stagnation? This is why families often resist individual members' growth most strongly. The family system has homeostasis, a tendency to maintain equilibrium. Each member plays a role that keeps the system balanced. The peacemaker, the rebel, the golden child, the scapegoat, these aren't just personalities. They're functional positions in a larger structure. When you outgrow your role, the entire system destabilizes. Your siblings may attack you for thinking you're better than everyone. Your parents may infantilize you, treating your new perspectives as youthful naivety despite your age. Your extended family may simply stop inviting you to gatherings, a passive excommunication that hurts less than direct confrontation, and you're left with an impossible choice: return to your role and betray yourself, or maintain your integrity and accept isolation. This isn't manipulation. This isn't abuse. This is the natural consequence of psychological systems protecting themselves from change. But natural doesn't mean harmless. Understanding the mechanism doesn't reduce the pain. The pain, beneath the pain. Let's go deeper. beneath the guilt, beneath the loneliness, beneath the cognitive dissonance and social pressure, there's another layer of suffering. The grief of realizing that the people who saw you most clearly at one stage of your life are now the people most blind to who you've become. This is devastating in a way that's hard to articulate, because these were the people who knew you, really knew you, who witnessed your struggles, held you through your darkest moments, celebrated your victories. Their recognition once felt like proof of your existence, and now their recognition feels like a cage. When they say, "I love you," you hear, "I love who you were." When they say, "You haven't changed," you hear, "I refuse to see your becoming." When they say, "Remember when we used to," you hear, "Please stop evolving so I can feel secure again." And the cruelest part? They're not wrong to miss you. The version of you they loved was real. That person existed. That person mattered. Their grief at losing that version is legitimate, but you can't be responsible for their grief. You can't resurrect a former self just to comfort them in their loss. The psychologist James Hollis writes about the middle passage, that period of life when we're forced to abandon the provisional identities of youth and face who we actually are beneath the layers of social conditioning. He says this period is characterized by profound loneliness because we're caught between two worlds, the familiar world we're leaving and the unknown world we're entering. And in that liminal space, relationships become mirrors showing us the death we're undergoing. Every interaction with people who knew the old you becomes a small funeral. They're mourning someone standing right in front of them, and you're mourning the connection you can no longer authentically maintain. This is the pain beneath the pain, the grief of realizing that growth sometimes requires you to become an orphan to your own history. The tyranny of nostalgia. Nostalgia is a liar. It takes the past and airbrushes it, removing the rough edges, the doubts, the moments of profound disconnection that were probably there all along, but which memory conveniently forgets. When you feel the pain of outgrowing people, nostalgia whispers seductive stories. Remember how good it used to be? Remember how easy connection felt? Remember when you belonged? But if you're honest, and this requires brutal honesty, were those relationships ever as perfect as memory suggests? Or were you simply a different person, someone who hadn't yet developed the capacity to recognize limitation? The German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche had a concept, eternal recurrence. He asked, if you had to live your life exactly as it's been, over and over for eternity, would you embrace it or curse it? Now modify the question. If you had to remain in these relationships exactly as they are, maintaining your current level of authenticity for eternity, could you bear it? If the answer is no, if the thought fills you with quiet dread, then you already know what you need to know. But knowing doesn't reduce the pain. Sometimes it intensifies it. The crisis point. There comes a moment, there always comes a moment, when you can no longer pretend. Maybe it's triggered by something small. Someone makes an assumption about your beliefs that's 5 years out of date. Someone tells a story about you that feels like it's about a stranger. Someone tries to give you advice that makes sense only if you haven't changed at all, and something inside you breaks, not loudly, not with drama, but a clean snap like a twig under snow. You realize, I cannot do this anymore. I cannot keep performing this version of myself. I cannot keep pretending that time has stood still, that I'm still the person they need me to be. And in that moment, you face the choice that defines this particular existential crisis. Do you speak your truth and risk the relationship? Or do you maintain the relationship and betray your truth? There is no third option. The middle path, staying connected while being authentic, only works if the other person is willing and able to meet your evolution. And often they're not. Not because they're bad people, but because they're human people, limited by their own fears, their own resistance to change, their own needs for stability. This is the crisis point, the moment of maximum psychological pressure, the point where ego and self engage in direct combat, where attachment wars with authenticity, where love as you've known it meets love as it might become, and you stand in the middle, torn apart by competing loyalties, loyalty to your own becoming and loyalty to connections that shaped your past. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron calls this the groundlessness, that experience of being suspended between identities, between worlds, with nothing solid to hold on to. She says this groundlessness is where transformation happens, but that doesn't make it less terrifying. You're experiencing the psychological equivalent of the caterpillar's liquefaction in the chrysalis. You're dissolving, and you don't yet know if you'll reform into something viable or if you'll just remain dissolved. And in that uncertainty, in that groundless terror, the pain reaches its apex. The liberation of solitude, the death that isn't death. Let me tell you what actually happens when you outgrow people you love. You don't become a monster. You don't transform into some cold, unfeeling creature who's transcended the need for connection. You don't ascend to a higher plane of consciousness where ordinary human bonds no longer matter. You become more yourself. And paradoxically, becoming more yourself requires a death. But what dies is not your capacity for love. It's your capacity for false love, for love predicated on self-betrayal, for connection purchased at the price of authenticity. This death is painful beyond measure, but it's also necessary, because you cannot become what you're meant to become while still clinging to relationships that require you to remain what you've outgrown. Carl Jung wrote, "There is no coming to consciousness without pain. People will do anything, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their own soul. The pain of outgrowing people you love is the pain of facing your own soul, of admitting that the self you've been performing, even for people you genuinely love, is no longer viable, of accepting that transformation is not optional, that consciousness, once awakened to new possibilities, cannot unknow what it knows. But here's what the psychological literature often misses, what the self-help books gloss over, what the spiritual teachers sometimes fail to articulate. This death is also a birth. When you finally stop contorting yourself to fit relationships that have expired, when you finally choose authenticity over belonging, something extraordinary happens. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, like dawn bleeding into a dark sky. You discover that the loneliness you feared, the isolation, the exile, the existential abandonment, is actually freedom wearing an unfamiliar face. The neuroscience of liberation. Your nervous system has been operating in survival mode. Every time you performed a false version of yourself, every time you bit your tongue to keep peace, every time you pretended to be someone you're not, your autonomic nervous system registered threat, not conscious threat, but biological threat. The polyvagal theory, developed by Stephen Porges, teaches us that the nervous system has three states: safe and social, fight or flight, and shutdown. When we're in relationships that require self-betrayal, we're not in the safe and social state, even if everything looks calm on the surface. We're in a subtle freeze state, present but not really present, connected but not really connected, safe but not really safe. And the brain, registering this chronic state of subtle threat, redirects resources away from growth, creativity, and higher cognition. You become narrower, more defended, less capable of the very evolution you're trying to achieve. But when you finally choose authenticity, when you stop performing, when you let relationships fall away that can only exist through your self-betrayal, something physiological shifts. Your vagus nerve, that wandering nerve that connects brain to body, begins to regulate differently. Your nervous system, no longer in constant defensive posture, can return to true social engagement. Creativity increases, cognitive flexibility improves. You literally become smarter, more capable, more alive. This isn't metaphor. This is neurobiology. The chronic stress of maintaining inauthentic relationships creates measurable changes in brain structure. The amygdala, the fear center, becomes hyperactive. The prefrontal cortex, the seat of executive function and future planning, shows reduced activity, inflammation increases, sleep quality decreases. And when you finally release those relationships, the process reverses, not overnight, not without grief, but measurably, verifiably, your brain begins to heal from the subtle violence of self-betrayal. The philosophy of authentic becoming. Martin Heidegger, the German existential philosopher, had a concept, Dasein, being there, the particular way humans exist in the world. He distinguished between two modes of existence, das Man, the they-self, and authentic Dasein. The they-self is the version of you that conforms to social expectations, that does what they say you should do, that thinks what they think is acceptable. It's not necessarily false, it's just not entirely yours. Authentic Dasein is what emerges when you take full responsibility for your existence, when you stop letting the crowd dictate your being, when you face what Heidegger called being toward death, the recognition of your own finitude and the freedom that recognition brings. Outgrowing people you love is a movement from they-self to authentic Dasein. It's the painful realization that the self you've been performing for others, even beloved others, is not the self you actually are. And this realization brings you face to face with one of existentialism's most uncomfortable truths. You are radically free. And with that freedom comes radical responsibility. You cannot blame others for your self-betrayal. You cannot make them responsible for your becoming, even if they resist your growth, even if they withdraw their love, even if they make your evolution inconvenient. The choice of who you become remains yours. This is terrifying, because if you're truly free, then you can no longer hide behind the excuse that you're staying small for their sake. You have to admit, you're staying small because smallness feels safer than the unknown territory of your own potential. Jean-Paul Sartre wrote, "Man is condemned to be free." He meant that we cannot escape the burden of choosing. Even refusing to choose is a choice. Even remaining in relationships that require your diminishment is a choice. And once you see this, once you truly internalize your own freedom, remaining in those relationships becomes impossible. Not because you don't love the people involved, but because you love truth more. You love your own becoming more. You love the possibility of who you might become more than the security of who you've been. This doesn't make you selfish. It makes you honest. The spiritual dimension, attachment and impermanence. The Buddha taught that suffering arises from attachment, specifically attachment to permanence in a world where everything is constantly changing. We form attachments to people, to identities, to ways of being together. And we suffer when those attachments meet the inevitable truth of impermanence, not because attachment is wrong, but because we attach to things as if they were eternal when nothing is. When you outgrow people you love, you're confronting this fundamental teaching. You're being forced to release your attachment, not just to the people, but to the version of yourself that existed in relationship with them. You're facing the impermanence of identity itself. Buddhist psychology distinguishes between two types of suffering: the pain that comes from circumstances and the suffering that comes from our resistance to pain. The first is unavoidable. People change, relationships end, loss is part of life. The second is optional. We create additional suffering by insisting that reality should be different from what it is. The pain of outgrowing people you love is unavoidable. But the suffering, the anguish, the guilt, the self-recrimination, the desperate attempts to freeze time and maintain relationships in their original form, that suffering is generated by resistance. When you finally accept impermanence, when you truly accept that you are not who you were, that they are not who they were, that the relationship that once existed cannot be resurrected, something paradoxical happens. The pain doesn't disappear, but it transforms. It becomes clean, honest, pure. It becomes grief without resistance, mourning without denial, love without possession. And in that acceptance, there's a strange peace. Not happiness, let's be clear about that, but peace. The peace of no longer fighting reality. The peace of allowing what is to be what it is, without demanding that it conform to your wishes. This is what the spiritual traditions mean by letting go, not abandoning love, but releasing the demand that love remain unchanged forever. The mythology of rebirth. Every culture has myths of death and rebirth, the phoenix rising from ashes, Jesus emerging from the tomb, Inanna descending to the underworld and returning transformed, Persephone's journey between worlds. These myths persist because they describe psychological truth. They map the territory of profound transformation, the kind of transformation that requires the death of an old self before a new self can emerge. In these myths, there's always a period of isolation, of being alone in darkness, of separation from the known world. The hero must descend before ascending, must die before being reborn, must lose everything before gaining something deeper. When you outgrow people you love, you're living this archetypal pattern. You're in the underworld phase, the chrysalis stage, the period of necessary isolation that precedes integration. And like all mythological descents, this one has a purpose. You're not being punished, you're being initiated, you're undergoing the transformation that consciousness itself demands when it's ready to expand. Joseph Campbell wrote, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." The cave, in your case, is the loneliness you've been avoiding. The treasure is your authentic self, no longer fractured by the need to perform for others, no longer diminished by relationships that require your smallness. But to get the treasure, you have to enter the cave. You have to face the fear. You have to be willing to be alone, to be misunderstood, to be the villain in someone else's story of betrayal. You have to be willing to let people think you've changed for the worse when you know you've changed for the better. You have to be willing to watch people you love struggle to recognize you. You have to be willing to become strange, even to yourself, as you undergo this metamorphosis. This is the hero's journey, but it's not heroic in the way movies portray. There's no dramatic moment of triumph, no audience cheering your transformation, no clear victory to celebrate. There's just you, slowly becoming more yourself, in a world that preferred you as you were. The discovery: you were always alone. Here's the revelation that changes everything. You were always alone. Not in the sense of being isolated or unloved, but in the fundamental existential sense. Your consciousness, your experience, your interior life, it's yours alone. No one else can access it directly. No one else can know what it's like to be you. All connection is, in a sense, translation. We use language, gesture, expression to approximate our inner experience and hope someone understands. And when they do, when connection happens, it feels like magic, like proof that we're not entirely alone in the universe. But that connection always depends on both parties being willing and able to meet in some shared space. When you transform beyond the shared space, connection becomes impossible, not because love failed, but because the prerequisites for that particular kind of connection no longer exist. Understanding this, really understanding it, is paradoxically liberating. If you were never truly known by others, because full knowing is impossible, then you've lost nothing that you truly possessed. If connection was always approximate, always dependent on mutual willingness to see each other, then the ending of connection is simply the ending of a temporary agreement, not the destruction of something eternal. This isn't cynicism. This isn't denying the reality and importance of human bonds. This is recognizing the terms under which those bonds actually exist, not as possessions we own, not as guarantees we can count on, but as graceful temporary alignments between separate consciousnesses. And when those alignments end, when growth takes you beyond the possibility of that particular connection, you're not being abandoned. You're simply experiencing the natural conclusion of a finite thing. Your fundamental aloneness, which existed all along, simply becomes visible. And once visible, it stops being terrifying, because you realize this aloneness is not emptiness. It's the space in which your unique consciousness exists. It's the foundation of your individuality. It's the ground from which genuine, non-dependent connection might one day grow. The paradox of solitude. In solitude, you discover something unexpected. Not loneliness, that's different. Loneliness is solitude with longing, isolation with grief, being alone while wishing you weren't. True solitude is something else entirely. It's being alone and being complete in that aloneness. It's discovering that your own consciousness is fascinating enough, complex enough, rich enough to sustain you. The German poet Rainer Maria Rilke wrote, "What is required of us is that we love the difficult and learn to deal with it. In the difficult are the friendly forces, the hands that work on us. The difficulty of outgrowing people you love is working on you, sculpting you, teaching you that your worth is not contingent on being recognized by others, that your becoming is not dependent on external validation, that you can survive and even thrive without the constant reinforcement of familiar relationships. This is not saying you don't need people. Humans are social creatures. We need connection to flourish. But we need the right kind of connection. Connection that sees us as we actually are, not as we used to be. Connection that celebrates our growth, not our stagnation. Connection based on mutual authenticity, not mutual performance. And here's the beautiful, unexpected truth. Once you're willing to be alone, once you've faced the fear and discovered you can survive it, you become capable of genuine connection for the first time. Because genuine connection requires that both people be fully themselves, and if you're still performing a false self to maintain relationships, you're not capable of genuine connection. You're only capable of mutual performance. But when you finally release relationships that require your self-betrayal, when you finally choose authenticity over belonging, you create space for relationships based on truth. Relationships with people who see you as you are and love you, not despite your evolution, but because of it. These relationships are rarer. They take longer to develop. They require more courage to initiate and maintain. But they don't hurt the way inauthentic relationships hurt. They don't require constant monitoring, constant self-editing, constant performance management. They're easy, in the way that breathing is easy when you're not holding your breath. The integration. This is where transformation completes, not in the descent, not in the crisis, but in the integration. You don't forget the people you've outgrown. You don't stop caring about them. You don't rewrite history to make them villains in your story of liberation. You simply accept what is, that you loved them once, that they helped you become who you are, that the relationship served its purpose, and that its purpose is now complete. There's no bitterness in this acceptance, no resentment, no need to blame them for not being able to accommodate your growth. They were who they were. The relationship was what it was. It gave what it could give, and now it's over. Not because anyone failed, but because everything has its season. The Japanese have a concept, mono no aware. It's often translated as the pathos of things or an empathy toward things. It describes the bittersweet awareness of the impermanence of all things and the gentle sadness that comes from this awareness. When you fully integrate the experience of outgrowing people you love, you arrive at a kind of mono no aware regarding relationships. You see them clearly, beautiful, important, finite. You appreciate what they were without demanding they continue. You honor their role in your journey without letting them constrain your next steps. And in this clear seeing, in this acceptance of impermanence, you find a deeper kind of love. Not love as possession, not love as need, but love as recognition of shared humanity, as appreciation for moments of genuine connection, as gratitude for the role they played in the story of your becoming. This love doesn't require proximity. It doesn't depend on continued contact. It doesn't demand anything from anyone. It simply exists, a quiet stream of goodwill toward people who mattered to you once and, in a sense, still matter, even though you've moved into different worlds. The future of consciousness. We've journeyed through the architecture of attachment, the crisis of authenticity, and the liberation of solitude. We've explored neuroscience and philosophy, psychology and myth, the personal and the universal. Now, as we prepare to return from this descent into the pain of outgrowing people you love, I want to leave you with something to carry forward. A perspective, a reframe, a different way of holding this experience that might transform the pain from meaningless suffering into purposeful initiation. Consciousness is evolving, not in a mystical, ungrounded sense, but in a real, measurable way. Each generation develops slightly more complex perspectives than the last. Each individual who undertakes genuine self-examination expands the territory of what human consciousness can encompass. And every time you, outgrows a relationship that requires your diminishment, you're participating in this evolution. You're demonstrating that human beings can value authenticity over comfort, truth over security, becoming over belonging. This is not small. This is not selfish. This is the leading edge of consciousness learning to value its own expansion. In previous centuries, most people lived and died in the same communities where they were born. Identity was stable, roles were fixed, and outgrowing your relationships wasn't even conceivable. There was nowhere to go, no alternative reality to imagine. But we live in an age of unprecedented possibility. You can be anyone, do anything, go anywhere. And with that possibility comes a new kind of psychological challenge, the challenge of choosing who you become, even when that choice requires painful separations. The pain you feel when outgrowing people you love is not pathology. It's not evidence that you're broken or ungrateful or incapable of maintaining relationships. It's evidence that you're evolving beyond the constraints that once defined you. And yes, it hurts. It should hurt. Loss hurts. Change hurts. Growth, real growth, always involves a death of some kind. But the alternative, remaining in relationships that require your self-betrayal, maintaining connections at the cost of your authenticity, choosing familiar suffering over uncertain liberation, that hurts too, more deeply, more corrosively, in ways that damage your capacity for future connection. So perhaps the question is not, how can I avoid this pain? Perhaps the question is, how can I honor this pain as the price of my becoming? How can I grieve what's ending while celebrating what's beginning? How can I release people I love without diminishing the love itself? There's a poem by the Persian mystic Rumi. It goes like this: "The morning breeze has secrets to tell you. Do not go back to sleep. You must ask for what you really want. Do not go back to sleep. People are going back and forth across the doorsill where the two worlds touch. The door is round and open. Do not go back to sleep." The pain of outgrowing people you love is the breeze that wakes you. It's the discomfort that prevents you from going back to sleep, from returning to the comfortable unconsciousness of relationships that no longer fit. And once awakened, you stand at that doorsill where two worlds touch, the world of who you were and the world of who you're becoming. The door is round and open. So what do you do now? You honor the grief. You let yourself feel the full weight of what you're losing. Not the people themselves necessarily, but the version of connection you once had, the ease of belonging you once felt, the person you were when those relationships made perfect sense. You forgive yourself for the guilt. You understand that your evolution is not betrayal, that growth is not selfishness, that becoming more yourself is not the same as becoming less loving. You give yourself permission to be misunderstood. You accept that some people will never comprehend why you changed, will never see your transformation as anything but rejection, and you release them to their interpretation, knowing that you cannot control how your journey looks from the outside. You embrace the solitude. You discover what's there in the space where familiar connections used to be. You learn to be fascinated by your own consciousness, to find sustenance in your own depths, to become your own good company. And you wait, patiently, without desperation, for the new connections that will find you when you're fully yourself. Connections with people who see you as you are and want exactly that. connections based on truth rather than history, on present alignment rather than past loyalty. These connections will come, maybe not quickly, maybe not in the forms you expect, but they will come. Because when you finally stop betraying yourself, when you finally become willing to be alone rather than false, you emit a different frequency. You attract different people. You create space for relationships that actually nourish rather than deplete. The ancient Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it." You cannot control whether people accept your evolution. You cannot force relationships to transcend their natural limits. You cannot make people see you as you actually are if they're invested in remembering you as you were. But you can control how you interpret this experience. You can choose to see it as failure, or you can choose to see it as metamorphosis. You can choose to believe that something's wrong with you, or you can choose to trust that you're exactly where consciousness wants you to be, in the painful, necessary space between identities, learning what you cannot learn except through this particular suffering. So I'll end where we began, with the photograph you cannot throw away. Look at it now, with everything we've explored in mind. Those faces, those frozen moments, that person you were who no longer exists. Can you see it differently? Can you hold both truths simultaneously? That you loved them truly then, and that you cannot return to that way of loving now? That the relationship was real and important, and that its time has passed? That nothing failed, but that everything changed? Can you honor the past without being imprisoned by it? Can you grieve what's ending without denying what's beginning? Can you finally forgive yourself for outgrowing people you love? Because that forgiveness is the door. That acceptance is the threshold. That release is the beginning of something you cannot yet imagine, a way of being in the world that's truer, freer, more aligned with who you actually are beneath all the performances, all the roles, all the versions of yourself you've tried on to please others. The pain of outgrowing people you love is the pain of consciousness recognizing its own infinity in a world of finite forms. It's the pain of being unable to hold still when everything in you demands motion. It's the pain of truth encountering loyalty and choosing truth, even knowing the cost. It's the most human pain there is, because only humans can outgrow themselves, can become strangers to their own histories, can love people while simultaneously loving the possibility of who they might become more than the security of who they've been. And if you're feeling this pain right now, if this entire exploration has resonated in the hollow places of your chest where familiar connections used to live, then you're already on the other side of something. You've already chosen becoming over stagnation. You've already paid the price consciousness charges for expansion. What remains is integration, acceptance, the long, slow work of building a life around your truth rather than around others' comfort. It won't be easy, but it will be yours. And in the end, that's the only thing consciousness can truly offer. The possibility of a life that's authentically, undeniably, courageously yours. The journey continues, the door remains open, and you, transformed, alone, liberated, stand on the threshold of whatever comes next. Thank you for walking this path with me tonight. May you find peace in your evolution. May you find courage in your solitude. May you find love that doesn't require your self-betrayal. And may you remember, when the pain feels unbearable, that you're not breaking, you're breaking open.